have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity.
We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. As if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy.
Silence! The great and powerful Oz knows why you have come.
You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature.
Don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, or what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts.
It's time to buckle up for making sense of the madness.
And who loves you? And who do you love?
Hey everybody, Jason Bermas here, and we got a great show lined up for you today. As you know, we have obviously been covering the Epstein news recently, and literally for over a decade and a half in many of the arenas that no one else will touch. I hope that you did check out the Mario Nafal great debate, because there are so many people that are still rooted in ignorance and denial, and this idea that there is not a vast amount of documentation about Jeffrey Epstein and his co-conspirators, as well as the operations that they were carrying out. We're going to get into that, and we're also going to get into the death of Virginia Giuffre Roberts for a bit with my guest, Nick Bryant. If you are unaware of Nick's work, Nick is the author of The Franklin Cover-Up. He has been in journalism for several decades plus and is one of the foremost experts in this case. So right out of the gates, Nick, I know you're itching to get going. First of all, I didn't have a whole lot of expectations that Trump was going to release all this evidence, despite the noise, despite what Pam Bondi was saying, etc. Even when Trump was asked initially before the election about RFK, JFK, MLK, 9/11, and Epstein, he was very hesitant about Epstein. He said, the other one's more, I don't know, I guess maybe we'll do the Epstein thing, etc. What were your thoughts then? What are your thoughts now? And where are we in the Epstein case?
At the time, I was incredulous, of course, because I know how deep Epstein runs in our government. But when Pam Bondi came out on national television and said, I've got the Epstein, I think she used the list on my desk and I'm reviewing it and it's going to be released in a couple of days, I thought to myself, that's interesting. And then what she ended up releasing, I released the Black Book and also flight logs in 2015. And I released more incriminating information on Jeffrey Epstein and his ilk than she did. And 10 years later, I mean, she had the Black Book that I put up on the internet. I just redacted the numbers of the people, and I redacted also the last names of the victims.
And Nick, let me just stop you for a second, because I think this is really important. I was on a separate space. It might have even been the Nafal space last year. And I have these lunatics claiming they're the ones that got the Black Book on the end. And I have to stop them. And I go, listen, I don't know what fantasy land you're living in. I know the guy that not only got it from the butler, but shopped it around to the mainstream media and got it published by Gawker. And they're like, well, redaction. I'm like, everything you needed to know was there. Like the stuff that came out later was nothing. We haven't had, in my opinion, any kind of new information other than maybe slight redaction since 2019. Is that correct? Basically, those are the majority of the documents and the information that we have.
Yes. I do believe that the Black Book and the flight logs are the grail to Jeffrey Epstein. Certainly the Black Book. I mean, there were a lot of people that weren't perpetrators in that Black Book, but then there were a lot of people that were perpetrators in that Black Book. And we haven't, the government really hasn't released anything new, but what we can surmise from what's happened previously is pretty substantial, because Pam Bondi and the Trump administration acted like they were reviewing all the videotapes that were taken out of Jeffrey Epstein's safe. And Jeffrey Epstein's safe was opened by either a drill or electric saw. I mean, whatever.
They sawed it open. It was not open by being cracked. We have photographs of it, and I would remind people that not only did you have the videos within that, you had the burn discs, you had the hard drives, you had the folders, and most importantly, that totally gets ignored, he had a passport for some reason with a foreign identity and a foreign address in Saudi Arabia that was allegedly given to him via Austria. Very suspicious.
So in his safe was the size of a closet. I mean, it wasn't the kind of safe that you think of. But the FBI and Department of Justice in that safe was opened the day after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. So they had all the footage of those girls, those underage girls that were getting molested 6 years ago. And they're saying over 1,000 now. I actually think it's definitely over 1,000. But Jeffrey Epstein was definitely pampering those kids. But here's what's really troubling to me is we have known, the FBI and Department of Justice have known about those victims for 6 years. Those hundreds, over 1,000 victims, and they didn't do anything to help those kids. They've known who those kids are. And because our government was so gung-ho on covering up Jeffrey Epstein, those kids were just collateral damage. Our government didn't care. And that just kind of exemplifies this whole case, is those victims were let down by every agency, state and federal agency. The only entity that didn't let those victims down was the Palm Beach Police Department. And Michael Ryder, he's a real hero here. He was the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, and he took a lot of heat for investigating Jeffrey Epstein. And they ultimately located 23 victims. But he took a lot of heat, and then that case was taken away from the Palm Beach Police Department and given to a very corrupt grand jury. And then ultimately the feds got involved, and it even got more corrupt. So that's why this case is so important. I've been writing about child trafficking for 22, 23 years and researching it. And I wrote a book about it, a large trafficking network, as you know, that was kind of Epstein was kind of a carbon copy of it in a lot of ways. And people ask me after they read the Franklin scandal, they say, well, this can't possibly be going on. And I said, and I invariably say, wherever there's a demand, there's a supply. That's just the way free market dynamics work. And with this situation, with the Epstein situation, with the Franklin situation, you had these victims let down by the state and federal authorities. There was a subcommittee of the Nebraska Senate that didn't let these kids down, but they took a tremendous amount of heat, and they were ultimately steamrolled by state and federal agencies. And the same thing happened with Epstein. The Palm Beach Police Department was steamrolled by state and federal agencies.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's start with the Palm Beach case, because one of the things that I kind of want to establish here is that although Epstein was absolutely a serial pedophile, it wasn't as though he was running like a brothel. In other words, people weren't scheduling to come in and out. He was using these girls not only to recruit other girls for that network, but then they would go to parties. He would use them as influence. That's how he would pimp them out. So say I want to cut a deal with Prince Andrew, maybe in some arms trades or something else. Maybe we'll go on vacation with Virginia Giuffre Roberts because he seems to like her. Or perhaps he has a group at the island and maybe the business isn't going that well, but everybody's partying and someone ends up in bed with an underage girl. He's taped that. Now that business deal that was a little sour may actually go through. That's how these blackmail networks work, correct?
Especially, yes. Especially if there's a child or someone who's underage. If you're on film with someone who's underage, you're owned. That's just the way it is. And when I was cutting my teeth on the Franklin scandal, and I realized how big and massive it was, and that it was hooked into intelligence, and my head was spinning, and I ultimately got to a blackmail photographer for the Franklin network, and I basically said to him, "How does this work?" And he goes, "Once you're compromised, it's like you're on a yacht. It's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day, and you can have anything you want on the yacht. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown." So there's zero incentive for people to come clean about this. It would destroy their families. It would destroy their careers. So that type of blackmail is the most powerful blackmail of all.
So let's talk about Palm Beach and the intelligence network. Now, for a long time, the intelligence stuff was never really discussed, but then you had this, I would say, resurgence in the case and interest right around the time that even Donald Trump brought it up in 2015 with Hannity. You know, the Whitney Webbs of the world were surfacing with their pieces. Vicky Ward ends up coming out and saying that Acosta, who was a part of the Trump administration at the time, I believe he was the Treasury Secretary, had cut the sweetheart deal with him because he was told that Epstein was intelligence and it was above his pay grade. Now, this is one of my arguments I make to people when they try to say that he wasn't. I say, well, number one, she said that, and she said he was connected to Adnan Khashoggi, a prominent arms dealer and a man who had a harem of women himself. Weird. But when Acosta is asked, he doesn't deny it. And not only does he not deny it, he talks around it. And then within, I think, 48 hours, maybe even 24 hours of that interview, he's standing arm in arm with Donald Trump resigning from his position. So to all those that say that that's a nothing burger, number one, Vicky Ward was never sued. The man lost his job. He's never spoken out against it since. The only thing that makes sense is that is true. And we should also remember that Alan Dershowitz helped cut the deal and is now actually saying he knows who was on the videos because he's seen parts of them.
When Epstein went down and Alexander Acosta, you're right. When he was being vetted by the Trump administration, they asked him, "Why did you go so light on Jeffrey Epstein?" And he said, "I was told to stand down, that Jeffrey Epstein was intelligence." What people don't know is that there's only two people, and I looked into this, I talked to some constitutional scholars. There's only two people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the attorney general and one is the president. And at that time, Alberto Gonzales was the attorney general and George W. Bush, II, was the president. So that cover up, and there's no way Gonzales is going to cover up a nationwide pedophile network without getting a thumbs up from his boss, the president. So that cover up went to the apex of the Bush administration. And every other administration since then has covered it up, regardless of they're Democratic or Republican. They've all covered it up.
And let me just say this. You know, I know that you don't name George H.W. Bush in your book, In the Franklin Scandal. Or I'm sorry, Franklin Cover-Up. But In the Franklin Scandal, the predecessor, really the book that got you interested in this and that you set out to disprove.
Franklin Scandal, not the Franklin.
Yes, again, your book is The Franklin Cover-Up. You did not name George H.W. Bush.
The Franklin Scandal.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm messing it up. See, No, I need to change that in the thing. See, I'm losing it. I'm getting older, Nick. So
Well, that happens. Time marches forward.
I've got it right next to me too, and I'm looking at it right now. In fact, I'm going to grab it for everybody to see. Now that I've put the wrong thing up there, it is right here: the Franklin scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And I brought this. I showed people on the Mario Nafal broadcast just your bibliography, and I encourage people. I go, listen, if you don't want to read the book, okay, start here, right here, and there's about 100 pages of documentation to go with this book. And as I was trying to say, in John DeCamp's book, he does name George H.W. Bush as one of the high-end clientele. Although you don't, you actually find more victims during this research than even the initial Troy Bonner, Alicia Owens, and Paul Bonacci, correct?
I had a list of 60 victims, and it was my job to find victims, find as many victims as I possibly could. And a lot of them were very marginalized. They had come from dysfunctional families. They'd been put in various institutions. They'd become drug addicts. They'd become felons. And a lot of them didn't use their social security numbers. But I was able to find 13 of the 60 victims, and I got 11 of them to talk to me. And there were sometimes I would look for someone for a very, very long time, and then I would call them up, and that conversation would last about 10 seconds. And that's what happened when I got to Epstein's Black Book in 2012. The victims were the first people that I started contacting, because you need to talk to the victims. And these victims that I called, a lot of them didn't want to talk to me, but some of them did. They said that they were being flown around the country. They talked about this island. And at that point in 2012, Jeffrey Epstein was a lone pedophile. And as soon as I got that Black Book and I started talking to these various victims, I realized this is a network. I suspected it was a network because that grand jury had been cooked so badly. But when I started talking to these Epstein victims, and then they started telling me about an island that they were flown to, then I knew immediately that I suspected that I was dealing with a network because of my prior research. But at that point, I knew absolutely that I was dealing with a network, and that network had been covered up by. And what the feds did is the feds had a list of 34 Epstein victims. Actually, I have that document. But they were aware of 40 Epstein victims. And they wanted to circumvent the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which basically states that if you're a victim of a crime, the prosecutors have to apprise you of its adjudication, and you do get an opportunity to challenge your perpetrators face to face, or say what you want to do, or say what you want to say to them. And that was, the victims in Epstein were completely deprived. What the Department of Justice did, knowing that there were 40 victims, is they made a non-prosecution agreement where they gave everybody blanket immunity.
All right, can we talk about that really quickly? Because again, that's something that I don't think most people understand, because they continually talk about a client list. And I go, listen, we already have co-conspirators as a part of that deal that we know about that have been sued in civil court. Leslie Groff, Sarah Kalin, Nadia Marcinko, a.k.a. Marcinkova. I believe there's another one I'm forgetting right now.
Leslie...
No, Leslie Groff I mentioned, right?
Groff, and then there was Adriana...
That's the one. But again, we know this covered multiple people. Ghislaine Maxwell was probably covered in this as well. However, it appears that the court of public opinion is what pushed the SDNY to do Epstein, and then eventually her go down. She's survived. I mean, and she's appealed. What are your thoughts on that? Is she now set, since this is closed and people aren't talking about these other perpetrators that I think would lead to more people in the network, obviously, that eventually she's going to get out of prison?
Well, I really hope that's not the case. If that's like the worst case scenario. I mean, there's a lot of people in the child rights movement, and we're fighting child trafficking. I mean, I'm not one of those people that came to this through my fascination with conspiracies. I'm one of these people that came to this because I think that children need to be protected. If you look at my writing before the Franklin scandal, I've written a lot on children's issues. With this, and it's kind of mind-boggling to me, the Trump administration is setting this field back 20 years. And if he pardons Ghislaine Maxwell, he'll have definitely set it back.
Well, I don't know that he'll pardon, but I think, I know one of the appeals has already been shot down, but we're living in a world where, Weinstein is about to be on his way out. People in the so-called alternative media like Candace Owens are, giving him like a praise interview and ignoring things like him utilizing Black Cube, these private intelligence networks via Israel to intimidate victims, etc. And, this intimidation.
His attorney was using Black Cube, and David Boies was representing a number of these victims. And this is how dirty it is. The government is now conceding that there's over 1,000 victims, which I've known that for quite some time, and I would say well over 1,000 victims. But if you get a settlement from the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, you have to sign an NDA that says that you will not go after any of your other perpetrators. Then it's just another example that Epstein was colluding with other people. Why would they have to sign NDAs? And what's really troubling about that, and David Boies is a dirty lawyer, and he hired Stan Pottinger to help him adjudicate these cases, and he's really a dirty lawyer. He's dead now, but he was very dirty.
Pottinger died, really. When did Pottinger pass away?
Pottinger passed away, I believe, a couple of months ago.
Oh, wow. See, I was unaware of that. We actually brought, Johnny Vedmore was within that space as well. Yeah. So we talked a lot about Pottinger, and Pottinger, again, having his hand in the Iran-Contra affair. And once again, when we're talking arms dealing, and we're talking the 80s, and we're talking people like Khashoggi, and we don't really know exactly what Epstein was up to other than his financial advice services in that time period, it really, points in that direction that he is involved in these networks. Where there are drugs, where there are guns and weapons, there are also women, girls, and boys, unfortunately.
And that Epstein Victims Compensation Program is very dirty. I've spoken at a number of anti-trafficking conferences, and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation has an annual summit every year, and I've spoken at 3 of those, and including those and a number of other conferences. And I've gotten to know a lot of people in the field and a lot of psychologists and therapists that treat victims that have been sexually abused as children. And I know 2 therapists who have counseled Epstein victims, and one of them is an eminent psychologist, eminent. She's been interviewed on a number of documentaries, on a number of television shows. She's very eminent. So both these therapists counseled Epstein victims, and those victims were under 10 years old when they were trafficked by Epstein. And we have accounts of Virginia Giuffre said that the youngest one was 12, but we also have accounts of them being 11 or 12 too. That doesn't jive with the media narrative that they were 14, which is still unbelievably egregious. But I believe that they were trafficking 10. Now, those therapists help their clients apply for compensation from the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, and they were denied. And the reason, and one of them had really solid evidence. I mean, she basically could tell you what Epstein's house looked like inside. So that's really horrific. And these therapists believe that they were denied because they didn't fit the cover story of 14 years old. They were younger than 14 years old.
So you're telling me that, along with the limited hangout that we've gotten, they literally denied victims because they were too young, not based on the evidence, just to keep a narrative of 14 years old. And, I would also remind people that Epstein, even after the Palm Beach case, did not have to register as a sex offender in the vast majority of states because of age of consent laws, including New Mexico, where we had Zorro, where Zorro Ranch was located, where that never was really investigated. We got some stories about Epstein wanting to seed the human race with super Epsteins and having this odd pregnancy room. We have that one small snippet from apparently the 8 hours of Bannon interviewing him, where he says, you have an island. He says 2 islands, and he goes, islands of Dr. Moreau, and he says, that's correct. I'd love to get some context on that. But when you're dealing with this guy and young girls, that transhuman technology, or at least what is public out there, we got a guy like Peter Nygard on tape trying to impregnate younger girls and then take their placenta tissue or fetal tissue so he could use it as stem cells to extend his life. Do you think these type of things were also on the table, and maybe that's one of the reasons that, other than the sexual proclivity, he would try to get them so young?
Epstein was into so many things, and there are things that we know he's into, but he was definitely a transhumanist. And Juliette Bryant is the woman that you're talking about, and she said that she was at Zorro Ranch, and she came to when she was in an operating room, and that her ovums were being harvested. And when we think about that, we think of Boys Brazil, but actually with Epstein, it's Brooklyn. And it's not that difficult to clone someone. Once in 1996, Dolly the sheep was cloned. And I knew at that point, when we can clone sheep, we can clone humans. And I knew at that point that there's got to be megalomaniacs out there, megalomaniac billionaires that are cloning themselves. And to clone someone is very interesting. It's really not rocket science. You got an ovum, you take the DNA out of the ovum, you put the DNA that you want in the ovum, and then you give it an electrical charge. Sometimes the charge is going to start the mitosis process, which is the cells dividing, and other times it's not. It's kind of it's a hit or miss. But there are people in New York City that are cloning their French bulldogs for $60,000, and actually you can clone a human right now for 1.5 million. So, and these guys had billions. So absolutely, they were cloning each other. I believe that. I have no doubt about it.
And again, I stick to what I can prove, but it certainly seems that they had the resources for it, not only the will. And again, I'm waiting for those interviews, Steve. Love to get the insight onto what he's going to tell us himself so we can get into more investigations. I want to move quick to Virginia Giuffre Roberts. Go ahead.
These guys have no morality whatsoever. They're psychopaths. And they have the technology to clone themselves. And they've got the money to clone themselves. Do you think that anything would be an impediment to them cloning themselves?
I only think it would be an encouragement. I'm just saying again, I tell people what's out there and where they can find it, because I know a lot of this stuff gets into science fiction. And I do want to make it clear that when I'm talking about cloning and you're talking about cloning and talking about French bulldogs, we're not saying like a fully gestated human so he could clone himself and put it in prison. We're saying you could clone and then literally raise a baby that would be your genetic duplicate. That's actually how the technology works. I want to move on. Go ahead.
One more thing about the Epstein Victims Compensation Program. 225 women, young women applied for settlements. And David Boies and Jordana Feldman was integral to the 9/11 victims compensation. So, and David Boies is David Boies, and they had no criteria of who would get settlements and who wouldn't. And some of the settlements were 5 figures, some of the settlements were 6 figures, and we have no idea. But there were 225 women that applied, and there were 150 women that were given settlements. And then 12 declined because they didn't want to sign NDAs.
And look, I can understand. Honestly, that gives me great respect for them, because again, these NDAs literally tie your hands behind your back, and then people are going to look at you differently if you break those NDAs later on. Why would you sign one in the first place if this was so important? And it brings a whole, I wouldn't say moral conundrum, but it brings a problem to the court of public opinion in that arena and lets them cast doubt. So
and people don't even know about that, and that's how victims heal themselves. Victims of this type of abuse heal themselves by talking about it and letting other people know about it. And the victims compensation program just completely shackles them from, and also it does something that the government can't do. It shuts these women up. The government cannot shut them up, but these NDAs do.
Well, I would also say that, you know, a lot of these women have obviously lived extremely tough lives during and then after the fact. And that, excuse me, brings me to Virginia Giuffre Roberts. Okay, because again, although I'm labeled as such, I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I don't break my jump to conclusions mat out every time something happens. And I try to look what the available evidence is. And I remember right before the suicide, I think within 2 or 3 weeks before, you had that weird car accident that was a bus accident. But then the bus driver came out. He explained what happened. We saw, you know, the woman that's apparently worked on her ranch that she was able to buy via this settlement in Australia with, I believe it was the Prince Andrew settlement.
She got millions.
Yes. So, you know, it was questionable whether she was even in there. You had the news that she had broken up with her longtime partner years before, but now there was an ugly custody battle, and she had lost custody of her children, one of which I believe was 19 or 20, but the other still teenage boys, still very devastating. And then you get the suicide news. And during that time period, I believe at least, I think 2 of her brothers were also there. Now, because of that narrative and the odd situation with her posting that picture in the hospital, I think that the suicide is much more likely than foul play in this case. However, people came out screaming that she was murdered, et cetera, et cetera. What's your expert opinion?
I knew, and we had talked a number of times. We'd exchanged emails a number of times. And when it started coming out that she was killed by the Mossad or that she was alive and living with Jeffrey Epstein, I felt like I had to write an article. And I did write an article. It's on Zero Hedge, and you can also get it on my website, nickbryantnyc.com. The bus accident was a minor accident. And Virginia spent, and she was ultimately driven to the hospital and checked out. And she spent the night in that particular hospital. Now, what happened is her and her husband split, and her husband preemptively put in a restraining order against her. And so she couldn't visit her children. But she ended up in a hospital the second time, and that's the picture that we see of her battered and bruised body. That was not a bus. That was not even a car accident. That was her husband beating her up. She had a long history of her husband beating her up. And I believe that she reached out to the children, and then her husband just beat her up, and her husband has possession of the children. And people that suffer from child sexual abuse, their suicide rate is 3 times higher than the general population. And plus, they have a tendency to marry abusers. And Virginia, I believe Virginia, the first time Virginia was molested, she was 7 years old, that we know of. And then she was put in foster care, and she was out on the streets at a very young age. And she was conscripted by a pedophile named Ron Eppinger. And he rented an apartment for Virginia, and pedophiles would come in during the day and during the night and molest her at will. And then the FBI started to move in on Eppinger, and then basically he hawked, after he was very violent to her, he hawked her to one of his buddies that was using her. And this guy was also very, very nasty. And then the FBI broke down that door and found Virginia in bed with this guy. And ultimately, she was going to go into foster care, but her father said that she would take her. And within a couple of months of that, she met Ghislaine Maxwell. And the reason why she was perfect for Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein is she'd already been conditioned. She already knew how to act. She could just dissociate and go into the persona or alter that was that would placate whatever a person wanted sexually. So with her DID and dissociative identity disorder, it used to be called multiple personality disorder. It starts to break down, and it's very useful for victims of abuse, because if you're getting abused and it's painful, you can just switch to a different alter, and that will take the abuse. And usually in the 30s and early 40s, that DID starts to break down. And I've written about DID too. I contributed a chapter about the dissociative identity disorder to a book that was a number of psychiatrists and psychologists had contributed chapters. It was also peer reviewed. So her DID was breaking down, and her husband was being unbelievably abusive, but she was unable to just switch. I believe, this is my extrapolation, that she was unable to switch to a different alter. And so that started breaking down. The way that she coped with abuse started breaking down, and her husband's physical abuse really escalated. And she loved her children more than anything in the world. She really loved her children. And then to be deprived of her children was just so much. And then that beating that her husband put on her, that we saw on the internet, she committed suicide about a month after that.
You know, again, it's very difficult because, again, that woman went through so much, and one of the people to get out of the Epstein network and bring it to light. I mean, she was one of those prominent people. I don't think people understand that, you know, a lot of the other high-level people, they stuck it out, and they ended up, like, marrying some of these rich and wealthy people, like Sarah Palin, right? Like, she was able to network. I mean, this is a vicious network, and you just mentioned dissociative disorder. You know, I know you did work with the Franklin scandal, and in these cases, you know, a lot of the times they are dismissed because people just can't believe that they can go into these altars, right? You know, I've watched, for instance, the Paul Bonacci testimony where he goes into, what is it, Arlie Army or something like that. And at first you think it's a goof, but you watch the whole thing, and all of a sudden he's giving you all this factual information. He's talking about, you know, being in the room when NAMBLA was conceived. I mean, some really heavy, hard-hitting stuff. And if you watch even the documentary that didn't make it, Conspiracy of Silence, you know, some of the people involved, they go, you know, at first it sounds like they're crazy, and then all of a sudden these dates are matching up, these people are matching up, there's evidence to go along with it. Can you speak to that, the benefit for the abuser of the disassociation, and why it is so common, and why it's not only just one altar with some of these people, it's multiple?
Paul Bonacci had multiple altars, and I believe that Virginia had altars. That's what happens when children are sexually abused, is they become dissociative. So some part of them leaves their body and endures that abuse. With Paul has said a lot of wild stuff, but I was able to corroborate him on a number of the things that he said. He said that he'd been through a mind control program, and there is another Franklin victim who has told me that she has also been through a mind control program. Paul said that he helped abduct Johnny Gosch, the newspaper boy in Iowa. And actually, we've proven now at this point that he did help abduct Johnny Gosch. And that's a wild story, but it turns out to be true.
And so, for those, again, because it's, you know, not since the 80s that was maybe a prominent name. He is the original milk carton kid that disappeared. Yes. Continue.
Yeah. So with DID, it's how people, it's just how the psyche copes with tremendous pain early on in life. And when you're dealing with someone that was sexually abused before 7 or 8, you're almost invariably dealing with someone with dissociative identity disorder. And the thing about Virginia is she had an alter that was very tough, that went up against all these lawyers with their depositions. And depositions can be harrowing. I mean, the idea of the deposition is supposed to get information, but actually the other thing that it serves is the lawyers get on you for quite some time. I've been through the deposition process. And she hung in there. And now that the Trump administration, she said that she was abused by Prince Andrew, by Bruce King, who was the former New Mexico governor, Bill Richardson, who was the former New Mexico governor, Alan Dershowitz, Leon Black, Ehud Barak, who is the former prime minister of Israel. So she went up against these attorneys. And her first deposition, I think it was in 2015, where she named a number of the perps. So now the Trump administration is just saying that everything Virginia said was a lie. She did waffle on Alan Dershowitz, but I believe that my personal opinion is that Alan Dershowitz had some leverage on her. I don't know what it was. Her attorneys won't tell me what it was, but I do believe that Alan Dershowitz had some leverage on her. And now that I know about her family dynamics with her husband, I think it would have been relatively easy to get some leverage on Virginia.
Dershowitz is an interesting character in this, and somebody, that we haven't named via Epstein that also points to not only political power, but you just mentioned Ehud Barak, the Israeli connection. That would be Les Wexner. And I bring him up because Dershowitz represented Wexner. Wexner was kind of able to defeat all of the allegations and civil suits. Dershowitz also, like you said, went to court with Virginia Giuffre and was able to win. And as I stated, Dershowitz is out there essentially bragging. First of all, he says that, of course, the allegations that are being withheld from the public aren't true, and that's why they're being withheld. But at the same token, he says, again, because he was the lawyer in the Palm Beach case, that he's seen the videos. Now, maybe he's seen some of the videos, but of course, we know Epstein barely served any time in jail. He was leaving jail with an escort on many of the days he was supposed to be there. And
molested underage girls.
Yes, and he was able to, have not only the Palm Beach place in Florida, we have the islands, we have New Mexico, and we have New York, where he was conducting these surveillance, and that wouldn't have necessarily been there either. What are your thoughts on what Alan Dershowitz has put into the public arena, and do you believe that he is part of the compromise in this Trump administration? Not only because Trump had a relationship with Epstein himself, but that close-knit network of Dershowitz being both Trump and Epstein's lawyer.
I had heard some things about Dershowitz even before I got into Franklin in 2002, and you think, well, that's very strange. But what people don't know is two attorneys that represented Virginia Giuffre, Brad Edwards and Paul Cassell, and Cassell had been a federal judge. They said that Dershowitz was a perpetrator, and they backed Virginia up when Virginia said that Dershowitz was a perpetrator. And Dershowitz sued them for defamation. They countersued for defamation. And Dershowitz was beating his chest. I'm going to get them disbarred. He was going to do a number on them. And that ended up in a stalemate. Those guys did not get disbarred. So that's an indication that Dershowitz is very dirty.
And by the way, you mentioned Bradley Edwards. I'd be remiss if you talk about that litigation and we don't talk about the fact that Bradley Edwards actually won a similar defamation case against Epstein. where
Yes.
it went all the way to jury selection before Epstein bent the knee. They essentially came up with a very carefully crafted letter where Epstein had to say that he had falsely accused Edwards of these things. It was, again, very carefully worded, but he also got some of money that has been undisclosed. I will say this. Edwards and his lawyer stood in front of the media in literally a row of 12 boxes of documents stacked 4 high in front of them. Folks, those would be part of the Epstein files. And yet they gave a binder of stuff that had been in the public arena a decade to a bunch of influencers and said, the most transparent administration in history. In your estimation, the paperwork alone, I mean, you know it as well as I do. If you go to court, listener, you can get thousands of these documents. We're talking about tens of thousands of pages that you and I can get. How much is still under lock and key that we may never see?
What I have done is I filed FOIAs. And I filed FOIAs not for the tapes or the images that were on the discs or the hard drive. I filed 2 FOIAs for reports on the discs and the hard drives. And when Epstein died, the Fed said the case was closed. So I filed the FOIAs. I mean, the case was closed, and they should have responded to the FOIAs. And then I was told that the case was ongoing. And then about 6 months later, I filed another FOIA, and they said that the case was ongoing. So, I mean, now that Trump has ostensibly just completely put the kibosh on it, if I filed a FOIA today, I guarantee you that it would come back that the case is ongoing.
What's next? You know, what is going to come of all this? Is this, again, just going to end up in the dustbin of history? Is this going to end up like JFK, where there's just constant speculation? Will we be able to find maybe someone else criminally accountable beyond reproach, get the momentum we need in the public arena, and then see something similar? Because I believe that's what pushed the initial Epstein arrest and the reason Ghislaine Maxwell, without people being in an uproar about this, that never would have happened. Is there any hope for anybody else? And if so, is it even on the level that it should be?
I started an organization called Epstein Justice, and we talked about that early on. And I've just been a writer over the years. I've never been part of a 501c3, let alone a director of a 501c3. But it's going to be up to we the people if we want answers. And Epstein Justice, what we're vying for is a congressional commission that's going to independently investigate this. And I might sound like I'm deluded that this is going to happen, but I believe that as Americans, we need to do this. Our government, when you cover up a crime, you're aiding and abetting that crime. So in the very least, our government is aiding and abetting child trafficking. We would never trust anyone who's aiding and abetting child trafficking. So we have to, as Americans, we have to make our government come clean. And we can do that. There was the labor rights movement. There was the civil rights movement. There was the women's rights movement. There was the gay rights movement. Now we need a movement that's going to help children. According to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, 25% of underage boys or 25% of underage girls and 5% of underage boys are molested in the United States of America. And a lot of people in the field think it's slightly conservative for underage girls and very conservative for underage boys. But if you just go with the CDC numbers, you're looking at over 50 million Americans that have been molested as minors. And according to the Department of Health and Human Services, they did a study. They're estimating that between 225,000 or 240,000 and 300, between 240,000 and 325,000 women and children are trafficked in the United States every year. Now, here's where it gets mind-boggling, is that there was a study that came out. It was the 2023 Federal Human Trafficking Report. So we've got millions of people that have been molested, millions of Americans that have been molested as minors, and we've had millions of Americans that have been trafficked in our lifetime. And in 2023, there were 664 people charged with child trafficking. So we're talking about a fraction of 1%, and there's millions of hours of child abuse material on the internet. And in 2023, there was 1,375 people that were charged with making or distributing child abuse material. So we're talking a fraction of 1% of these criminals ever get charged. And this is why Epstein justice is so important. If we allow the Department of Justice to completely be apathetic and unresponsive to victims in a proven trafficking case, the Epstein case, that sends a message to millions of victims that they have no hope and no voice. And that's why we have to do something about this. Is there are millions of our fellow Americans that have been molested and trafficked, for that matter. And we have to let them know that they can stand up and they can say, I was molested. If the way that the Epstein plays out and it's just quashed, think of all the people, all the victims that are going to think that they have no voice and no hope for justice. That's why Epstein justice is very important. And when I first was on your show talking about Epstein justice, we didn't really have a modality to really do what we were trying to do, which is get a congressional commission. And now we do. And I would really strongly suggest to the people that are viewing this or listening to it that they go to EpsteinJustice.com. And every month we have webinars on how we give people tactics on how they can pressure representatives and senators in the government and how we can force a congressional commission. It's not going to be easy, but I believe it can be done. And if we can do it for labor's rights, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, we can do this for children's rights. Now is the time. And the fact that we're only charging a fraction of 1% of the people that are molesting children, trafficking children, making child abuse material, our society has to do much better than that.
I totally agree. EpsteinJustice.com. You can also follow Nick at Nick_Bryant, and you can check him out at NickBryantNYC.com. That'll give you also a link tree to all of those things. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. You want to leave the audience with anything?
Just go to EpsteinJustice.com and let's make a change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Folks, you know the drill with me. It is not about left or right. It is always about right and wrong. If you enjoy this material, remember, there are no paychecks right now. I need your support. $5, $10, $15. It means the world to me. I'm actually heading out to Tulsa, Oklahoma for the Red Pill Conference. No, I don't get paid for any of this, so all the support that you can give is very, very appreciated. I absolutely love you guys, and we will see you all on the flip.